Hi, my name is Kevin Oliveira. I'm the Senior Product Marketing Manager for Data Security Solutions at Forcepoint. I cover our data loss prevention product, and today I have Jason Kemmerer. Jason's going to be sharing with us about our DLP solution, giving us some in-depth demos around some of the key core features that we have in this product. Jason, would you like to identify yourself and maybe tell us what you'll be sharing?
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. So yeah, hey everybody, I'm Jason. I'm one of the consulting sales engineers at Forcepoint, and today we're going to be talking about why customers choose Forcepoint. We know what makes us so great in comparison to the other data protection vendors out there, and I'm really going to take you on a quick snapshot of what I call the DLP pyramid. And what this does is really show the wide breadth of different inspection capabilities that we have. And starting at the bottom, we're going to just start off by saying we have over 1,500 different classifiers that are pre-built, which really offers customers the widest support of files able to be inspected, from an intellectual property perspective, PHI, PCI, PAI compliance, even down to certain geolocation or industry verticals, really giving us the most comprehensive out-of-the-box portfolio than some of our leading competitors.
So with that again, So with that again, you said over 1,500 predefined templates. Why is that important for the customers that they have so many? Because as you mentioned before, we've got 1,500. I've heard people mention that we have 3 times as many as our leading competitors. Why so many, and how does that help our customers?
Yeah, so it's a great question. In our eyes, our goal is to simplify a very complex DLP deployment. The commodity of DLP these days is that you're constantly having to define things on your own. And out of the box, with this pyramid in question, we really offer the most intuitive identifiers that really make sense to whatever industry you're operating in, or like I said before, about the countries and regulations. And we're going to be showing that throughout the demo in a little bit here.
Great, thanks.
Sure thing. So the first thing I really like to touch on are the first 2 pillars of that pyramid, which are the keywords, the phrases, and the regular expressions. That's typical for any DLP module in the industry today. But the real advanced features are towards the top, which are the file types. So first of all, we have the largest catalog for full file type detection. So what does that mean? So we have over 600 files we're able to inspect against, whether it's image files, text files, Office files, CAD files, you name it, we're probably able to cover it. And the cool thing on the endpoint that we have is we have the ability to do true file type detection. And that's going to be able to prove that if a file is manipulated, such as a Word doc or an Excel document, and then it's potentially has its extension changed, or even has its a list of hundreds of Office files compressed into a zip. As long as it's not password protected, we're still able to inspect and identify that that is the true file type and the content within it.
Wow, great.
Yeah, and another cool feature that we have moving up on that pyramid is the classification labels, which I'll dive to a little bit later, but having that automatic classification is one of our largest strengths. So whether a file has never been labeled before or tagged, or even if you're migrating from one vendor to another, our inspection engine is just manipulating that header or footer information so we can easily tag those files. And if you have a subsequent DLP policy that says, if found confidential tag, and it doesn't have sensitive data, we can still block against it just based on the ranking.
You have listed Microsoft and Bolden James. So are those the only classification companies that we're able to work with, or applications, or are there any others that we work with? And how is that different?
Yeah, so those are the 2 leading ones that support the automatic classification, but we can actually integrate with any third-party classification system. So whether you're bringing in third parties such as like Varonis or Titus or any in-home grown labeling or tagging solution, again, we're just looking at that header information. So we can still apply DLP policies to it. We just won't be able to automatically tag that as a result of a global scan, or automate it in case someone decides to user define or tweak the label. We won't be able to readjust it, but we can still apply DLP to it, no problem.
Great. So in terms of automation, we've got a really strong connection with Microsoft Information Protection and Bolden James.
Absolutely.
So that's taken care of. Otherwise, we can, of course, still integrate with the labeling that they're interested in, that they typically would like to be using.
Yep, absolutely.
Okay. Yeah.
So the other top three really are our differentiators. So for example, natural language processing scripts. A lot of customers ask us, what does that mean? I think a brief example would be password protected files, or for PCI. There's so many numerical combinations that you can think of that leverage those previous pillars of the DLP framework: keywords, regex, file type support, even proximity. All those different combinations are actually bundled into a single script. So if the characters are really close together, but if they're far apart, we're able to easily toggle default, wide, and narrow, and then apply those additional identifiers to maintain the highest level of accuracy. And then last but not least, the last two, just very briefly, I'll dive into them a little later into the demo, but machine learning is just, in a nutshell, form contextual analysis, training positive and negative samples to reduce the number of false positives. A brief example of that would be invoices or forms that its sole purpose is to capture sensitive data. And instead of granting an exception saying, hey, you're just allowed to send this type of data out, we can just train the system to say, hey, this is something we want to ignore. And if it does contain sensitive data, the DLP is going to catch that ordinarily. So just train the system to make better decisions. And last but not least, file ID fingerprinting or precise ID fingerprinting, similar to index document matching and exact data matching. That's just looking at the full file, its hash value, any subsequent pieces of that file. So someone tries to extract a sentence out, or perhaps even is trying to take the entire file or manipulate the entire file, we can still block and inspect that file in its core. And then last but not least, the exact data matching piece, which is kind of the very highest echelon of inspection with 100% accuracy based on the records that the customer will provide, whether it's from a customer database extract or it's a direct database connection, things of that nature. So
now you list both structured and unstructured data. And so particularly with the unstructured data, how is it that these two are particularly important and a kind of a differentiator for our DLP solution?
Yeah, so excellent question. So the reason why we really focus on this is because we actually do support exact data matching, index document matching across all of our threat vectors. So whether you're looking at it from discovery, the endpoint, the network, and even the cloud, we can support that crown jewel use case, whether it's your customer records, your medical record numbers, your patent IDs, your employee information, such as their first, last name, unique identifier, account number, you name it, we can containerize that. And regardless of the format that it comes in, ignoring the regex, ignoring the keywords, we just need to know that exact piece of information and the other subsequent identifiers tied to it. That way you always know that when Jason his info is being exfiltrated, it doesn't matter what the channel is, and it's going to be centralized across the platform. So.
Okay.
Awesome. So let's take a pivot over to the UI and we'll get started. So here is the home dashboard. This is where the DLP administrators log into, but let's just dive into the meat of the policy predefined wizard. So as I mentioned before, we have over 1,500 different policies in this wizard. As I may have hit on, we're able to isolate it by regulatory compliance needs, PCI, PII, PHI, intellectual property. We can even isolate it by particular industry verticals if you're operating in more than one, if you're a public traded company, and even the regions that you operate in. So if you're a US-based only or you're a global-based company, we have different regulations based on the state or even the country levels that we can sift through in order to make that out-of-the-box creation. We can start ramping you up faster, really taking you from 0 to 60 in regards to actually start identifying and using the solution just from day one.
So list how many regions? It's 95 regions that are listed?
That's just the ones that are selected on the actual sheet, but we can select all of them, and I'm pretty sure there's at least 300, give or take. And then obviously we can expand, or sorry, 150, but we can expand or lessen the amount of industries and toggle the different options within the policies themselves.
Great. So that's a combination of it's countries as well as states that
Yes.
makes up these regions, right? Okay.
Absolutely. And the first thing I'm going to quickly dive into, right, is credit cards. So regardless of whatever industry you're in, you're probably going to be looking at credit cards. And this is kind of a very good way of showing all the different types of inspection that we have. So over here on the right side, you're going to see 19 rules of different types of credit card calculations. Those identifiers are going to talk about the major banks that are out there. If you need to bring your own, that's when I would recommend, exact data matching in that case. But the real big hitter is this default one. We enable that one by default because it really encompasses all the possibilities of the major banks. It's looking at if the number is a prime number, checking against the first couple digits and the last couple digits to make sure it's a valid credit card using a LUN checksum algorithm. And this is a pretty common policy that I would say all of our customers use by default, but that doesn't mean you can't customize or even tweak the rule after the fact.
If you were going to move away from this default one that covers just the broad use case, what kinds of things would you go for? What would be an example?
Yeah, so an example, like I mentioned before, was in the financial industry, sometimes you will have your own internal payment cards. That was a perfect use case for fingerprinting, for example. So in case they don't apply to those major banks, they're not a Visa, they're not a MasterCard, but you have your own internal system, or you have 16-digit strings that you're trying to protect, that's when I would potentially not use what's credit card out of the box, or even mix and match. So an example of that would be, hey, if it's an exact data match, an internal credit card, but we can apply Boolean logic to it that says and, or even not, which is a key differentiator. We can say, hey, it is ours and it's not going to be compliant to PCI DSS ordinarily. Maybe we should apply a different type of remediation action to it, such as an audit or even a coach, because it's not public facing or it doesn't belong to an actual, customer or client out there in the wild, right?
Great.
Cool. So I'm actually going to pivot over to the classification integration real quick, just because we have the different labeling solutions, right? It's very easy for us to successfully import them in just a matter of a couple clicks. So we have a brief example of Bold and James, but let's take a look at Microsoft Information Protection. In this lab here, we just have the Azure AD credentials, and we're able to import that schema and apply any policy, whether the label says confidential, internal, or public. So what's that going to look like from a policy perspective? A common question that customers ask is, why does this matter? Over in this role here, we're able to apply, essentially, if you think about it, non-DLP or non-content specific rules. So let's just say there's an overall security policy coming from the top down that says any file, regardless of what's in it, if it's like a secret project or if it's source code and you don't have quite the DLP policies that are looking for that type of content just yet, you're very easily able to still remain enforcement upon that policy, right? So if all files that contain Project Phoenix, for example, are found at discovery, and we automatically classify those files as confidential, you can easily apply that severity of either user coaching, are you sure you want to send this out, or even be more restrictive and even block the policy. In addition to the policy creation, though, you can assign this to specific users, such as your VIPs, your IT staff, various computers and networks, and then even centralize and apply this specific policy to any channel possible, whether it's the email, web, USB, network layer, cloud apps, you name it. So
what we've done then, it sounds like, is we are able to take these existing policies, these classifications like from Microsoft or Bold and James, and then we're able to apply all of these different policy rules to them, right? So if it is confidential, then we can go in and we can say, these are the specific actions in this instance that we want to apply. This is the source that as far as where it's coming from and destination as far as which channel it's going out. We can do all of that in just with that one piece of data. Is that correct?
Yeah, spot on. Couldn't have said it better myself. So I'm actually going to take this a little bit more advanced real quick. So a quick pivot to a different policy. I mentioned exact data matching, that really high crown jewels type of use case that most of our customers are going to use. I'm going to call out healthcare in this case, right? So I really want to show the condition, right? So we can toggle the date of birth, social security number, first and last name. But what's really the real kicker here is the amount of flexibility and customization that we have. So you can see all those different components of the pyramid. We can even alter the attachments and transaction sizes. But if I decide to, for example, add a extra policy, for example, or let's say we take an X header that is also classified. So now we're combining labeling support as well as exact data matching, and we can apply that customization to tweak the policy further. So now we can actually customize the said policy that says, okay, hey, so let's take that specific piece of information and we can do, if it is an exact data match, but let's say we're in the possibility of it not blocking because we're either scared of blocking, the industry or the customer isn't ready for blocking yet, but we coach it. But if the label on the file also includes confidential, maybe we should take a more restrictive stance. So by easily combining those two identities, identifiers, we can, for example, like I said, just automatically block all the transactions. And we can even manipulate this to add in additional classifiers. So we can splice up the date of birth, the names, the medical record numbers, you name it, and then apply that. And last but not least, that not statement I mentioned before, that's a real key differentiator that a lot of our competitors don't have. So when you're using our out of the box in combination with your user defined that you may bring into the table, we can make sure there's no cross pollination or potential false positives whenever you're using two different identifiers together. So
that's interesting, using the Boolean logic to be able to get greater precision, which is really awesome. I'm just wondering on this, particularly with the not, because you'd mentioned before, it isn't often in our competitors. I don't know if it's in any of our competitors that they make use of not. Where is it that would benefit us or benefit a customer, be able to have that not option?
Yeah, so a lot of customers that are new to our DLP framework, for example, or in the realm of credit cards, if specifically, if I'll start with one example of if you're not familiar with our solution and you are bringing old dictionaries from another competitor, sometimes you don't want that cross-pollination because our policies are really black box. Granted, you'll be able to pick them up whenever you're actually running the DLP solution, but that's our intellectual property as well. And the thing is, we don't want DLP administrators, we don't publicize any of mechanisms of how our policies work, is because at the end of the day, we do not want to have our administrators, our users bypassing detection. And by leveraging that not statement, like I said, you can tweak it. So if, for example, you get a lot of false positives on the word diabetes, but you're a diabetes center, maybe you should ignore it. So you could add in that extra dictionary that says, okay, ignore diabetes by itself, but only when it's applied with exact data matching as like a diagnosis, for example. That is a key differentiator because that will maintain the ability to violate, right? And then another example would be credit card numbers. So let's say we want to get more restrictive on the credit cards, very tight proximity, but we want to ignore all 16-digit strings that don't pass one checksum. That's the algorithm we use to validate a true credit card. So using the narrow credit cards and saying not any 16-digit string, which may be common of generic account numbers, or let's say you have a database that has 16-digit account numbers. They're not necessarily credit cards. That's just a numerical string. We can actually just automatically ignore all those, still maintaining that high level of accuracy. So
yeah, that's great.
So now I'm going to actually dive into the various action plans that we can do. So this is pretty much a compilation of all the different modules. And what's really cool is that all of it lives in one place. We don't have multiple UIs. You don't have to go hunt down, oh, I need to change how the endpoint responds to this, or the network, or even the cloud applications. Everything's built into these action plan templates.
Are you able to go into and just show as far as what specifically they're able to do by channel? Because it looks like you've got different channels, but they've got different types of descriptors below each one.
Yeah, so some of the big hitters we like to talk about on the endpoint layer specifically is our ability to permit, block, confirm, which is user coaching, and even the different methods of encryption. So quick example of those two would be internal to internal. If you have the agent and it matches my agent on the endpoint, we don't have to do any password protection or anything like that. I can maintain sharing files with you over an approved USB drive. The other one would be user password. So this is the case, let's say, Kevin, you're external or a contractor, but I'm not supposed to be sharing that information with you. But let's say I move those files. Each of those files are encrypted and I share it with you. If you popped in that USB into your endpoint, you wouldn't be able to open any of those files, not without the password that I tell you over the phone. So
that's great.
On the network side, however, a big differentiator that we really like to hit on, because email and web gets kind of ugly at times when you're looking at the endpoint. So we really want to leverage either MTA workflows or even ICAP or proxy chaining with third party or even our own web security vendors. The email is really where we show our strengths, right? So not only can we audit, coach, and permit, but we can take more advanced remediation after the fact. So for example, dropping attachments if they are deemed sensitive, but sending the rest through. Other ones would be encryption or even quarantine and release mechanisms. A really cool thing of our quarantine release mechanism is that, which I'll show in a second, is it's one-click remediation. So whether it's coming from the user, we can notify the manager to release the email, or you can have the SOC analyst just say, hey, this user is complaining that my email is stuck in quarantine because it contains sensitive data. It's very easy for me to look at that incident in just a matter of seconds, review it, and then release it, and then we're on our way.
Great. Oh, you're going to look some more. I was wondering, I saw the cloud one down there. I was wondering what else you have.
Yeah, so
as far as what we're able to do.
Yeah, so for cloud apps, very similar mechanisms. So in the cloud, whether through the cloud proxy, we're able to do things in line, so real time. So similar to a web proxy alert, we're actually able to audit or even block them and use the web browser to block that interaction, saying, hey, you've been blocked. This information was deemed sensitive. Maybe you should have a link on the bottom that says, in order to remediate this effort, either contact your security team or put a ticket through the help desk, and then we'll grant you an exception after the fact, or we'll give you an alternative method of uploading that sensitive content. Otherwise, at the API level, we have a lot more options, but it's going to be post-mortem. So it's going to be after the fact, right? And each service provider has different types of SLAs that support how fast they operate. But a big hitters of these are permit a safe copy of the file itself, put into a quarantine location. We can quarantine the file. We can leave a note. So one example would be a bunch of sensitive content like a fingerprint or a bunch of customer records. With our inspection engine working with the cloud app, we can essentially take all the information out, strip it out. The file name will remain, but we can leave a brief message that says a typical block message. Hey, this information was deemed sensitive. It contained X, Y, and Z. Please submit a ticket to have the file restored, or talk to the help desk for a ticket for an exception. Otherwise, the typical unsharing. So if you share internally or externally, we can toggle that as well.
How many cloud apps do we cover through this?
That's a good question. So for API, we support about 6 to 10 of them specifically on the modules, because Office has many, many applications. So does G Suite. So from an API perspective, it really depends on the partnership that we have. But for the proxy level, that inline upload, download from a managed or unmanaged device, we support over 100 of them. And if you want to bring your own, that's another beautiful thing that we can support as well.
Great.
So real quickly, we're going to talk about discovery too. And the reason why I want to hit on this as well is because we already talked about the classification integration. But another cool thing that we can do is, like I said before, automatic classification. But let's say this is a post-mortem scan and someone was changing the files, whether it's on OneDrive or on the user's endpoint or even on a file share. They say, hey, I want to be able to send this file. I know I can bypass it by moving it to public and then sending it out real quick in case the DLP policies aren't strong enough. Well, now as a post-mortem remediation action, you can say, hey, well, let's say they try it, they get blocked, and they're in the process of complaining. A few minutes later, if they try to close and reopen that file again, our data at rest scanning is differential. So we're able to see, hey, this file changed. Let's go find it and then put its proper label back in place if we need to. And thus we can then reapply that confidential label, whether it's through Bolden James or MIP. That way, next time that user tries to do it again, it's going to be confidential and then maybe even be blocked.
Wow.
And then last but not least, for any of those remediation actions, very common for administrators and operations teams, we have the typical add or remove forensics. We can run the remediation scripts on the endpoint. Like I said, quarantining, seize, put back, as well as syslog messaging. So moving over to your SIM and SOAR platforms. And last but not least, notifications. So emailing the user's manager, SOC team, you name it. As long as you can receive an SMTP alert, we'll be able to let you know high level what information or incident data may be of interest to you.
Now, is this a default configuration? Because I noticed you had the overall one checked, but then there's a lot that are unchecked underneath for audit incident. Is this the default as you see it right here, or is this had you already been moving some of the stuff around?
Yeah, so by default, we audit the incident and we include the forensics. It's up to you if you want to toggle with or play with the syslog messaging or even the email notifications. But those templates are already pre-built for you. It's a very quick and simple setup.
Okay, great.
So last but not least, I mentioned before, showing the source, how to apply it to various user groups, directory entries, networks, even custom users and computers. If you know the name of the device or the user, you can include and exclude them from policies or even apply an exception based to them. And just again, a recap, we cover network and endpoint email, we cover web traffic, we cover cloud apps, API and inline proxy, printing, applications such as cut, copy, paste, clipboard, or even file access. So in the case of using FTP services, we actually can stop you from using the application as a whole, as long as it's running an executable layer. And then USB and then endpoint LAN is for connected devices or file shares. So that's the full gamut of DLP protections that we can apply.
Great.
So over here, we have an endpoint. We have dlptest.com, which is a very typical DLP testing site. And we have various types of samples that we want to use. So a very brief example that I mentioned before was data labeling. If I decide to upload a file that is deemed confidential in the tag, we can do user coaching. And this is just by default, you know, the policy violation, a built-in timer, what type of controls, and all of this information will be reported back into the incident manager. But let's just say it's approved by my manager. I need to send this out for end of quarter requirements.
So in this situation, the user themselves, they're notified. It's recognized as a potential a security incident. And so they're notified, and then they make the confirmation or the rejection of it. It just gets noted at that point.
Exactly.
Okay.
And I did click block on this because it does have sensitive data in this case. But let's take another example, right? So I mentioned network email earlier. So here we have a brief little draft. So I'm just going to say test. But the kicker here is that this financial report has a lot of sensitive data. We're talking about account numbers, birthdays, full names, and values, right? So let's take this file and let's attach it over the network email layer. So let's just test. We'll call it personal data. You know, this user's trying to be malicious, and this is just a test run. If we try to email that out externally, we can block that transaction as well because of the fingerprinting policy we have in the back end, which I'll show the incident management at the end. Right. So you can see two typical examples of blocking.
So this situation was outright blocked. There was no opportunity for the user to be able to explain it and to be able to continue to move on. This is just blocked. Okay.
And other examples of the notifications may look like something like this. Hey, there's no details in this example, but if you wanted to share that information to the manager, the user independently, we can really just add that notification pretty seamlessly with the email integration that we have.
Great.
Cool. So I'm going to flip back to the Forcepoint Security Manager. And before we show incident management, I want to show really what the future of Forcepoint looks like. So you can see we have tons of rules, tons of different classifiers that look at behaviors. We have different industry verticals, you name it. And that can get pretty intensive, right? The more mature customers get, or ones that don't have enough DLP staff or education on the program itself, how do we make their lives easier? So here we have an example of risk adaptive protection. So what that means is that we're able to take any policy, any exception, let's say credit cards, for example, but now we're changing how we look at the policy in itself. Instead of looking at a match count of 1, 5, and 10, we're using a collector agent that works with DLP to look at the risk of the user. So whether the user is going to inappropriate websites, whether the user is going to Facebook and sending things over chat they're not supposed to, or they're visiting competitor websites, maybe they're going to LinkedIn looking at resumes, or they're downloading a bunch of data from a file share or a browser or a cloud app, that may be indicative they may eventually or soon commit a data exfiltration event or scenario, right? So how does risk adaptive protection apply? So from a risk level perspective, here's a brief examples of not recording the incident because we have tens upon millions of incidents every day. Maybe we only care about the ones that actually are important to just lessen the burden on the administrative staff. But then we can apply notifications to them if they escalate, right? More usage, more downloads. Let's start notifying the manager saying, hey, this person has an exception, is playing with tons of sensitive content. Let's start perhaps even coaching them when they get questionably risky. And then last but not least, we can apply encryption if they try to move it to USB, because once it hits that secondary physical medium, the information is pretty much gone. Otherwise, we can just block it. That is just
Again,
one example.
This is watching a specific user, or watching all of our users. But in here, there's a specific user. They've been doing some behavior that gets them into a risk level 1, where there's something happening. It's really something that we would continue to allow. But then it looks like then with each level, somehow they're moving to higher and higher levels of severity, right? And then it's just then we have different types of responses to still same policies, maybe, but then just they get a block because they're risk level 5. That's what's going on, or?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is how we're really changing to be proactive. Instead of writing the same policy for different channels, like 3 or 4 social security number policies, one for web, one for email, and creating exceptions based on that, now you have 4 rules and 4 exceptions, and you're applying different action plans to each one. That gives you, let's say, 300 rules. But we now simplify it. Instead of looking at it from independent channels, looking at it from exceptions, looking at it from fear of blocking, now we have a logical reason and path to blocking. But that's just one example. We don't have to do that, right? We can even make it so, let's say the use of FTP is not a bad thing for IT staff, but we definitely want to know about it. We can toggle it to be less restrictive. We can say, hey, if they're low risk, don't even audit it. 2, let the manager know this guy's constantly using FTP. He also is an IT administrator. Maybe he's trying to bypass DLP, but then we can start coaching over and over and say, hey, are you sure you want to do that? Are you sure you want to do that? As the risk level increases, thus reintroducing education into the framework. And you can really understand that regardless of how sensitive the content is or the process behind it, even if it's broken, we still have multiple methods in order to, 1, reintroduce coaching and education, maintain enforcement, and then lessen the amount of policies and incidents for all your DLP staff. So they're just less burdened overall. So really a comprehensive story behind risk adaptive protection.
This is great. It's I'm just looking at all, it's just because we have all of those policies you were just describing, but this gives us added context to the specific activity that's going on. And it's just like one person could be highly suspect. I mean, it could be a high risk person, but another person could be absolutely should have the freedom to be able to share. And you've got that context you're able to apply to the policies just through this tool. It's pretty exciting.
Yeah, I mean, like I said before, it uses its own collector engine with indicators of behavior, and it's looking for the things that DLP isn't seeing. And let's say your DLP framework maybe isn't mature. When you combine and marry those two together, that's really where DLP can start acting smarter, and the time to value on the return and I guess the education, because usually you need an SME to run DLP these days, but you no longer need to require that when everything's looked at from a risk lens instead of a static regulatory, compliance, location, user type lens, right? There's so many other mechanics for eliminating all of that. So
right, that's great.
Cool. And the last section we're going to be talking about today is incident management. As I mentioned before, DLP is not just a shelfware product, it's a full-on program, and it applies to multiple different areas, from the network team, the email team, productivity, cloud teams, you name it, right? How do we make DLP admins' lives easier? And over here on the left side, we have various workflows, remediation, and escalations. But before I touch on that, the biggest thing I want to take away is that how we violate is different than other of our competitors. In some cases, I've seen for every violation on a particular attachment or an email or a transaction, you might have each violation creates its own incident. Well, we don't do it that way. We actually compartmentalize and compress all those into a single incident. So in a single transaction, if it has multiple policies firing against it, maybe it has 50 rules firing against it, we're going to only show one incident, which is going to make your lives so much easier. So over here, we have 2 different credit card rules, but both of them are still being applied in the same incident. So what does that happen from a workflow perspective? It makes things a lot easier. So whether you need to change the status, open it, close it, you can assign it to other administrators, you can change the severity, you can ignore, tag, add comments. The key here is that we have one-click remediation. So over here on the network email layer, I mentioned before we have that quarantine release mechanism. It's now easier for when a user complains or gets that block page, or they don't have their manager around, or maybe their manager's on maternity leave or anything like that. they can just say, hey, help desk, can you release this email? Or hey, security team, can you just release this email for me? It's very, very critical. Just a quick little synopsis. If they're allowed to touch PCI data and it's part of their job description, then sure, it's very easy for me to just do click and release. And just in a matter of minutes, that user is going to be happy and that information is going to get delivered. Otherwise, on the endpoint layer, we can do remediation scripts, right? So I talked about that tombstoning, like extracting the information and posting, hey, your file's been seized because it contains X, Y, and Z. Well, we can actually return that file back. Like, hey, this is critical. I'm working on a shared project. Can you please put my file back? We're collaborating with this partner. Same premise, one click, remediate. And then again, in a matter of minutes, script runs and it puts the file back right where you left it, thus making the customers happy.
It's exciting. I think just with one click, in a typical DLP solution, not a Forcepoint one, but just one where they don't have this one-click remediation capability, what would they typically have to go through as far as how many steps, how much time? What would that typically look like?
Yeah, good question. So depending on the number of violations, right? If they have over 100 rules and let's say there's 7 violations, they essentially would have to go, okay, I have to click each individual violation, make sure they're all okay, and then I can possibly allow it or deny that transaction to be flagged. Then it finishes the ticket off or even releases it. There's just a lot more analysis involved when really we have that perfect high-level snapshot. You get all you need in one place. There's hardly any clicking at all, right? And then also, if you need to get a second opinion, it's very easy for you to escalate the incident. You take all the information from the incident, high-level details. The sensitive data is already masked. You can not mask it if you want, right? And you can escalate it to the user's manager directly, your manager, other clientele, or even share it with employee relations or HR for a second opinion. It's actually very easy for you to toggle and tweak directly from the incident manager without having to go to another set of screen, another console, or anything like that, which truly makes us a huge differentiator for a holistic program. So
right. Well, the way you describe it, I would think this could save hours even. I think of a data security admin's time. If they had to go through each one of these and they didn't have all the data at this level in this view to be able to do remediation. So that's amazing.
Yep. Yeah, well, that's all I have for today, Kevin. Did you have any additional questions or?
No, this is awesome. Thanks so much, Jason. So anyways, if as you're watching this, if you're interested in getting a live demo, something that'll and more questions specific to your own situation, certainly please go to forcepoint.com/DLP. You can do a request for a live demo there, and we'll be happy to help you with your situation. We do also have we commonly do migrations from competitive DLPs. We have a service we're able to work with you. We have like a 16-week time frame for it, and so we have a good a bench of knowledge to be able to help you in terms of migration or even your initial DLP deployment to make it so that it's simplified, it's efficient, and we'll be able to help you get up and running to have a very secure environment through DLP. Thanks.
Thank you.